Welcome to the SMU Archive Series. This is a series in which we interview members of the SMU community who can provide insight into the history of the university, especially from the perspective of their time here. I'm James Brooks, and today we have with us Ellen Solender, who is a retired professor of law. Ellen, welcome. And let me recap just a little bit for the benefit of the record. You and your husband Bob both went to Oberlin.
Right.
And then you came to Dallas and you raised 3 kids.
Right.
And then decided that you would go back to school.
Not quite. I had not fully raised them. They were still in school here in Dallas when I went back to school.
Back to law school.
Right.
Good. Well, now, about when was that, Ellen?
That was in 1969.
Okay. And so you came as a law student. Talk a little bit about what the law school was like from a student perspective at that time.
Well, of course, the law school was very conventional. I mean, it was in that it had the usual courses that they'd had for, I don't know, maybe 50, 75 years. I don't know. The major thing was that Dean Galvin was very proud because he had managed to get 12 women in the entering class of about 200. And unfortunately, with attrition and all, not that many graduated. But one of the things that was clear from my point of view was the hostility of the males to the females. And one of the things that was interesting to me, and I was thinking about this the other night, a lot of the students seemed to feel that we shouldn't be in law school, that we were taking the place of a competent male. And this was before affirmative action ever got thought of. And it didn't seem to occur to them that we were just as competent as they were. And they felt we didn't have any business being there.
And so you were resented.
Oh, yes.
Big time, I take it.
Yes.
Well, I remember at that period of time, of course, what is now a building with another name was called Lawyers Inn, and it was restricted to men graduate students, or men law students, I should say.
Right.
What you said at the beginning, I think, is important, because you said Dean Galvin deliberately recruited 12 of you. Mm-hmm. And so that was really breaking the line, and it was a conscious effort on his part to move the law school in the direction that ultimately it has gone to almost a 50-50 basis now.
Right, right.
Because I remember when I became provost in 1972, I think there were only about 2% of the law students were female. And 10 years later, when I left administration, it was about 40%. 35 or 40%, which was remarkable and very encouraging. Well, students always have a different perspective on deans and faculty than we have about each other. Share with us a little bit of your perceptions from that vantage point at that time.
Well, one of the things was that the older male faculty really didn't like having women. And basically, you didn't have to really be prepared for class if you were a woman, because you were never called on. And if you raised your hand, they didn't call on you either. So you know, it was that kind of deal. And then over time, as I went up moved up in the process, and got different, less hidebound teachers or professors, then I had to be prepared and be able to participate in class. And I know I drove my tax teachers crazy, because I would ask questions like, why do we have deductions for interest on houses and no deductions for child care? And things like that.
Yeah.
And But in my dealings with my fellow students, I don't know why exactly, but it got very nice. And since I was a good student, I made law review. And so the law review group was very nice to me. I was the only woman on law review. And then I was elected to this strange organization called Barristers, which I think it still exists. And you're selected on grades and personality. And again, I think I was the second woman, or maybe the third, to be elected to Barristers over the years. And but that was a high honor.
Of course.
I mean, from the standpoint of the fact that at the beginning, no one spoke to me until I spoke to them.
Times have changed, haven't they?
That's right. That's right.
Well, who were some of your more interesting? Started to say favorite, but let me say more interesting faculty. Who do you think back on as having meant a lot to you as a student?
Well, Harvey Wingo, but the person that was most dramatic was Arthur Harding, who we all knew had been the boss of a chain gang in Arkansas, and he was, I should call him Colonel Harding, and we all believed that because that's the way he behaved. But he taught contracts, and he taught constitutional law, and I remember taking my final exam in constitutional law with a high fever, and my husband, I know as a mother I wouldn't have allowed my children to do this. He said, "Are you sure this is the mature thing to do?" And I said, "Yes, because if I don't take it today, I have to wait a year," because he would give no makeup exams under any circumstances. So I took the exam, and I hope I gave him the flu. Anyway, after that, I took a course from him that was most astonishing. It was on civil rights. Now you have to realize he's not a man that favored civil rights, but he gave there were only 6 of us, and he gave a very good course on civil rights, very fair. And it was really surprising, considering I knew he disapproved
what he personally felt, yes.
Yes. So I would say he was one of the more interesting professors.
Did you have con law from him?
Yes.
Rather than from AJ?
Right.
Uh-huh.
Right. And then, of course, the tax professor was Scott Morris.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to say much about Scott
All
Morris.
right. Are there any others that you would like to comment on particularly? Because you started really at the time when the law faculty was
turning over,
just beginning to turn over in a
right.
significant way, which really happened a lot in the 70s.
Right. Well, see, that was after I was on the faculty.
That's right. That's
and
right.
That's what changed my life on the faculty.
Was the turnover.
Right.
Yeah. Because
I again, Charlie is the one that got me on the faculty, and when I was became an assistant professor, it was the same year as 3 others, and we all got tenure together. So that meant there were a group of us that were younger than other faculty members. And after a few years, there were even more changes. And my goal, and the only reason I stuck it out, because it was very difficult. I had great difficulty with my students. They remember they were mostly men, and they didn't like having a woman professor. They had expected Kingsfield, and they got me instead. And my student evaluations were simply dreadful. They made up things, and one of the most, I've always have felt that the reason I got tenure was that my student evaluations were so ridiculous. And the one that stood out was they said that, remember they never called me professor, Mrs. Solender uses language that's inappropriate for a law professor. And the faculty sat around and wondered what it was that I had said. And so I think they decided that the whole thing was a hoax. And so I got tenure.
Well, by whatever means, the university was better for that having happened. Well, before you moved to the faculty, weren't you in a staff position for a short time?
Yes, I was the head of legal writing, research methods and legal writing. But I continued that after I got tenure. And in fact, until my first sabbatical in '81.
So you were director of that program and assistant professor at the same time?
Right.
Okay.
Right.
I wasn't quite sure about that. Well, then, you've talked a little bit about your period of time on the faculty. You had, because I knew most of your colleagues very well in that period of time, because that was when I was involved in university administration, and you had some very interesting colleagues.
Yes, I did. Bill String was one of my favorites.
Well, Bill was a person who enjoyed interrogation.
Right.
And every time Charlie would invite me over to have dinner with the law faculty, Bill was one of the principal interrogators. But he was a good guy, and when I left administration, I got a very lovely letter from him.
Well, one of the things about, he was one of those people that was willing to hire women. And that was the thing. For one time, I was chair of the faculty curriculum committee, and we made a number of suggestions, all of which were turned down. A year later, when I was no longer chair, the same suggestions came up, and they were not turned down. So I decided then that if I wanted things to be done, I'd never be chair. So when the hiring committee was established, because we didn't have, up to that time, faculty, the committee system at the law school was complicated, and we won't go into that. But anyway, up to that time, the executive committee had been the hiring committee, or the faculty recruiting committee. And then they decided to make it an independent committee, different committee. And since I had been on the executive committee and had been hiring, they suggested I be chair. But I said, no, I didn't want to be chair, because I was sure we'd never get a woman if I were chair. And we had Dan Schumann was chair. And he did a very good job of getting the faculty to vote yes on a number of women that we hired. And so the number of women that we hired increased.
Yes, because now, I don't know what the percentage is now, but there's a healthy percentage of women on the law faculty.
Right, and we have, for almost 10 years, I don't remember, I'm very bad on dates, but for a very long time, I was the only full professor on the law school faculty. In fact, as you know, there were almost no full professors in the university.
Women full professors.
Right,
yeah.
I'm sorry. And then, and I think, they're the only possible full professors. But anyway, we've changed that. I mean, they've changed that since I've left. There are more full professors that are women. But the other problem, you see, there's a downside to being a full professor, is if you're a full professor, you're kind of prominent, especially a law full professor. So it seemed to me I was on every kind of committee that could possibly involve a problem.
Well, you were on the faculty senate, you were involved in the women's movement, you were on a tenure appeals committee.
And on the judiciary.
and on rank and tenure committees.
Right.
And probably more than that.
Right. So.
Well, talk a little bit about that, because this was a period when you were fighting your battles in the law school, but the university was fighting its battles with getting women integrated as rapidly as possible into the whole structure of the university.
Well, there was the Commission on the Status of Women, I think
Yes.
it was called, and I was on that. and active with that. And one of our biggest problems, my biggest problem, was salaries. And I know I was always terribly underpaid. And the day I really knew I was underpaid was the day I got a 27% increase to base. So I knew that they were trying to make up something. But no, this was something that the commission really, really worked on. And we also tried, but at that time, I'm sure I trust that the university has improved on this, but we also tried to get maternity leaves for the staff. And it wasn't only the faculty, women faculty we were trying to get equity, it was also women in general.
Yes.
And so that was another thing that we tried to do. And then, of course, as you say, I was on all these committees, and every time I'd be on a committee, I'd always, I shouldn't say this, I guess, but I'd always suddenly realize what a terribly inferior school SMU was. There would be another terrible thing that they did.
Well,
the worst are the fraternities.
Yes, yes. And unfortunately, we don't have a corner on that, but we have the fact that we are in that position is unfortunate. And
right.
It's changing, but not as rapidly as it should.
Right, and the judiciary, when I'd be on the judiciary, it was always some male fraternity that was
in trouble.
Right. And then the other things that bothered me were the other schools had such bad methods for arranging for tenure. They were so unfair to each other. And that was
Can you elaborate
difficult.
a little bit on that? Because this was something that I tried to address when I was provost.
I can't tell you exactly because I very carefully forgot a lot of things. I've forgotten all the people that weren't nice to me at the law school, and I've forgotten some of the which departments had real injustices. I think the business school did for a while. The engineering school
Yes.
Did. Even the School of the Arts got into trouble.
Yes.
And it was because they didn't, well, see, people attack lawyers for writing out long things and putting them in writing and explaining, etc. But these schools didn't have their tenure policies in writing. So they would vary. And I'm not sure that it was always done to the detriment of the person seeking tenure, but it seemed that way.
Well, at very least, it produced terrible inconsistencies from year to year.
That's right.
So people didn't know what they had to do.
That's right.
And that affected men as well as women.
Right, and that was, I mean, almost all of the tenure messes I was involved in involved men.
Yes.
And and they didn't have any set deals.
Well, and that was something that really we tried very hard to change. It's very hard to change systems when people in control are comfortable.
Right.
They don't want change. That's human nature.
Right. Right.
But I hope the university has continued to make progress in those areas. Now, you must have seen quite a bit of change from the time you joined the law faculty to the time you retired.
Yes.
And I take it this has changed, moving in a favorable direction from your perspective.
Right. Well, first of all, my students changed, or just because I don't know whether if you're there a long time they think you know something, rather than if you see when you go to a doctor, you want to go to a young doctor because he just got out of medical school and he knows all the latest things. They don't think of law professors that way. You have to, be older, and then you know more. But this is just very interesting, and there's been studies on this, and it's true. I used to, as the classes got more and more mixed, I would try to figure out the percentages of women and men and minorities. And then I would try to call on them in accordance with the numbers that were there. So,
So you were very deliberate about that.
oh yeah, and I would check it off and make sure that I was being fair. But I got criticized for calling on women too often. They said I called on women too often, much more than men. Even though if at the time women were 30% and men were 70%. Calling on women 30% of the time was wrong. Now they got over that.
You were denying men their opportunity, is that the thesis?
Right.
All right.
But see, they got over that. And one of the things that I have to tell you that was the nicest thing that happened was when I announced I was retiring. And my torts class gave me I didn't bring it with me, obviously, a lovely gavel made out of glass as a memento. But the two classes that one of the classes I enjoyed teaching the most, and I'll tell you about that in a minute, and the other class was family law. And the two of them more or less got together and they decided to buy me an appropriate present. And so they did, and they bought me a bracelet from Tiffany's.
Well, isn't that lovely?
And you have to realize they did it very democratically. They raised the funds, and when they figured out they had enough money, they then took a Tiffany's catalog and passed it around the class and got them to check off what item
they thought you would like.
That's right. And there was a class vote, which I thought was really...
That's neat. That's very neat.
Right, sort of amazing.
Well, it is, but it's a tribute to what they thought of you, and that's nice.
But then
we don't get recognized or appreciated as much as we know we are entitled to.
That's right. Now, the class that I enjoyed the most, and that has resulted in a continuing thing, was something I thought up, and in order to teach it, I had to teach an overload. And that is, it was called First Amendment and the Mass Media. And, First
Right.
Amendment law. And it is really a fun class. It's all really about speech.
And you have fresh material every day in the media.
Right,
on that.
right. And as a result of that, when I retired, somebody gave an anonymous gift, and they asked me what I wanted it for, and I said I wanted for First Amendment and mass media in the library. So there is now a room and a website and, of course, lots of books, because it isn't the biggest fund in the world, but it's big enough that they're able to buy books every year.
Sure.
And the website, in quotes, is free. Of course it isn't, but,
Yeah. Well, that's nice, and that's a tribute. Obviously, other people think that it's worth doing.
Yeah, now, as to AJ, I always
We're talking about
enjoyed-
A.J. Thomas now.
Right, A.J. Thomas. I always enjoyed him very much. And he sat in on one of my classes. I guess it must have been when I was moving from associate professor to full professor. So he came to one of my First Amendment and mass media class. And it was a 2-hour seminar with a break. And I knew what was coming, and I was very nervous having A.J. there. And we were going to discuss the case of the 7 dirty words. But it wasn't till the second hour that we got to it. And one of the students, knew this in advance, and we didn't talk about it in the first hour while AJ was there, and then he had to leave, thank goodness, because the student brought a tape and played the tape of the 7 dirty words. So I'm not sure that AJ would have appreciated that.
Probably not.
Because especially, it being in a class taught by a woman, and such words shouldn't be said in her presence.
That's right. Well, AJ was a delight as a colleague. I, of course, knew him as a faculty member, and for a short period for I guess a year and a half as dean ad interim.
Right.
And because he followed Charlie when
Right.
Charlie resigned from the deanship. Talk a little bit about, let's see, you retired what year?
94.
94. So you have worked with about 4 or 5 deans.
Yes.
And I'm just interested in I don't want to in any way put you on the spot, but deans differ in style and so on. And any comments that you would be comfortable making, I think would be interesting.
Well, of course, my favorite dean was Dean Salacuse.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know why, except that he had been a colleague.
Yes.
And when I went, I said, you know, I don't trust deans. And when
Most faculty don't.
No. And when you become a dean, I'm not going to trust you. But I'll like you anyway. So I don't know that he did anything in particular that I liked. And Charlie was really a dean for my student years. And then, you know, there was that mess up with Zumberg where, well, I can understand why anybody would mess up with Zumberg. He was a strange man.
Jim was a very distant person in many ways.
Right,
And
right.
The closer you were to him in the line, the more distant he was.
Right. And I always remember he didn't approve of closing the law school, I mean the university when we had those marvelous ice storms.
Well, you probably you should blame me more than him, but anyway, go ahead.
But and of course Harvey Wingo was good, and I liked Paul Rogers. But see, these are younger people.
Yes, yes.
And
they had been your colleagues.
Right.
In a couple of cases, anyway.
Right, right. And then now see here, I've forgotten his name. It begins with a P. Well, it doesn't matter.
It
was the dean that we fired.
Yes.
The faculty fired.
Yes, yes, and he had come from another university and was just here a short time.
Actually, I think he was sick at the time, because the reason the faculty revolted was because he never made any decisions.
I was out of administration by that time,
right.
but he had been on the list when Jess Salacuse was picked.
Right.
And I was not surprised when he came then after Jess left. I was not surprised because we had detected some of those same concerns. I was out of administration then. Same concerns, and that was a principal reason that he was not picked the first time.
Well, it was unfortunate.
Yeah, yeah. Well, those things happen, and unfortunately, the institution is always bears the brunt of the impact of it.
Yeah. Well, any time that you make a false step in hiring, especially in a position where they have tenure and all that kind of thing. I mean, it's very difficult to undo it.
Oh, it's terribly difficult, and fortunately, he was able to leave without a great deal of difficulty, and that was good for him and good for the university.
Right.
And those things are regrettable when they happen. Well, now you started out by talking about the curriculum when you came as a brand new law student, having been set in concrete for millennia.
Right.
And now, how did the curriculum change while you were involved with the law school, or did it?
Well, it did change in that there are more opportunities to make choices. You don't have to have everything every
lockstep.
year. Right. So there are really a lot more options. I don't think our law school will ever go as far as Yale, but I don't think I have no idea what Harvard is doing today, but the Harvard model, our law school doesn't follow exactly anymore. Mm-hmm. I mean, you took, torts, criminal law, torts, criminal law, property, what else? in your first year, and you couldn't take constitutional law until your second year, and you know, income tax and all these. A lot of these things were required courses. And
So you were really effectively in a set pattern.
right, there were 4 towards. Gosh, I'm forgetting something serious. Oh well. Anyway, a lot of these things. Now I did something that a lot of people didn't approve of, but I would still do it, and that is I always said that before you could take family law, you had to take income tax. And people would say, why? And I would say, well, there is no, since lawyers mostly are hired for divorce, no divorce occurs without tax consequences. And you need to know not the law of tax, but when you need to call in a tax expert. And if you don't know anything about tax, you can't know that.
Yeah.
So it's very important. I mean, that you could take tax at the same time as family law, but I wanted people to have tax.
That's interesting and a very logical reason. A layperson wouldn't think about it particularly, but as I listen to you explain it, it makes all kinds of sense.
Right. Now, really the most wonderful professor, and he's still teaching, is Joe McKnight. I had Joe McKnight, and Texas matrimonial property. Okay. One of my problems in his class was that he's extremely funny. And the students never caught on to it, the other students. They would sit there and I would think, you know, he's really being funny. Why aren't they laughing? But one of the wonderful things he did for me, he also did this with another law student who is a prominent attorney, Clarice Davis. He had us as assistants on the revision of, the writing of the Texas Family Code. So I wrote and worked with the committees while a student on the Texas Family Code, which was then introduced to the legislature and passed. And Joe McKnight is a very interesting man and appears very prejudiced, except he really isn't. And he makes outrageous remarks.
For effect.
Yes. And yet, and you would think he would be against women. And yet he wrote the sections on Texas matrimonial property, which give women rights. I mean, men have the same rights, but it's a gender-neutral section, which means you can do what you like under,
Yeah.
I mean, whichever party wants to do whatever it wants to do. And when he was away one year for a sabbatical, he asked me to teach his course in Texas matrimonial property. And I don't think people appreciate how difficult that is. I think you could do it in any state in the United States, and it would be equally difficult. Because matrimonial property is all the property that anybody can possibly own.
Yeah.
So there's all this question of how do you divide it, and here in Texas, how you characterize it. And you sort of have to learn. You have to learn partnership law. You have to learn corporate law. You begin to learn about, stocks and bonds and whether or not they've vested, and pensions, and all kinds of things that it never occurred to you were part of family law, of course.
Of course, but that's very logical, and
Yes.
I knew Joe as a faculty colleague on various university committees and so on, and enjoyed him enormously, and he had did have a sort of a devilish sense of humor that I always enjoyed thoroughly. I'm not sure that everyone else did, but I did, and so I know what you're talking about.
Well, see, and the other aspect, he's interested in history.
Yes, very much interested in history. That's
Right.
his Oxford background,
And
among
so,
other things.
so that's one of the problems. Again, law students don't understand they really should. It's not wrong to study legal history, but they think it's a waste. You know, is it practical? Am I going to make money out of it, et cetera? That's one of the. I mean, that's the standard question. If you suggest that they look up something, they say, "Well, will it be on the final?"
Yes, it's not. Will I be a better educated person?
Right. Right.
It's what do I need to do to jump over the next hurdle?
Right. And see, this is what makes Joe so marvelous. When I was talking to Joe about our trip to Sicily, and I mentioned that Sicily had been conquered by the Normans, and southern Italy it had been, and he said, "Oh, that explains why adoption law in southern Italy is more like the adoption law in northern France than it is in the rest of Italy."
Because of the Normans.
Right, right, and he's probably right.
Probably so.
Right, because he has a great interest in adoption and the law of it. And
Really?
Oh, yes.
That's a facet I never discovered.
Oh, yes. But most people don't realize that there was no adoption in England until the 1920s.
I didn't know that.
The only way you could adopt anybody was by act of parliament.
My goodness.
See, and we started having adoptions early in the United States.
When did they begin here?
Practically immediately.
Really?
So it's just different. You know, Joe would discuss these things with you if you would start the conversation.
Yeah, and he always amazed me at the breadth of his knowledge. And
Right.
you'd make some statement that you had no knowledge that he even knew about or cared about, and,
Right.
and you could have a 10-minute discourse on it.
That's right.
And I find that very refreshing, and unfortunately, not as many of us are able to do that as we would like.
Well, the other thing that I always enjoyed was it really didn't matter. It doesn't really matter how, when you argue with him, what side you take, because he's always on the opposite side. And if you switch sides, he switches sides. So
It's an intellectual exercise with him.
so you never get anywhere. Now, the one thing that you do know is my students, most SMU students, are Republicans. And one of the questions they would always ask me in family law is, how do you know if you're a good parent? And I would say, well, I know I'm a good parent. And they would say, how do you know that? I say, because none of my children has ever voted anything except the straight Democratic ticket.
Well, that's a criterion that I haven't heard applied before, but I couldn't argue with too much. What about, have you had any students that really stick out in your mind as being, you've mentioned classes and so on, and that's great. Are there any individuals that have gone on and done interesting things, or that stick out in your mind as being ones you remember?
Well, I don't know if I remember them or I know them, but Maureen Armour, who is on the faculty now, was what I remember grading her paper and just being shocked by how excellent it was. I mean, it was just astonishingly good. This was in torts in her first semester, because as I recall, at that time we'd had an ice storm and we didn't have any power at home, but we had sunlight. So as long as the sun was shining, I could grade. And I remember grading her paper during that period. So she's one, of course. And another is also on the faculty, is Beth Thornburg. Mm-hmm. So I don't know, I don't really know all those names and the students that stood out, but there are some, and after all, Judge, she's just been appointed a judge on the federal bench.
Oh, yes.
Lynn.
Lynn.
That's her last name.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm getting very bad with names.
You don't have a corner on that.
She was one of the outstanding students, and one of our more conservative members of the Texas Supreme Court was one of our outstanding students, Nathan Hecht.
Mm-hmm.
He was in her class, actually. Barbara Lynn.
Barbara Lynn, right.
Judge Barbara Lynn. And her husband, I remember, he's very good. And there are a number of other students that are excellent. And I remember one student, this was in the days when you had to type. I mean, you could type your exams. We didn't have computers. Doesn't seem possible. But anyway, so this student typed his exams. And his exams were excellent. And among other things that was so astonishing was they were written in full sentences and full paragraphs with no strikeovers. So I asked him.
And this is typing, not using a word processor.
That's right, just plain typing. And so I asked him one day, because we were walking, this was after he had graduated, and we were walking to the courthouse together, and I said something to him like, do you think with your excellent typing skills, you'd be willing to be my secretary? He says, no. He says, I can't do that because I only type with 2 fingers.
Well, there are all kinds of reasons, aren't there?
Right, but that kind of thing is, I always used to tell my students, writing, that you can read is important on exams.
Absolutely, because I think any of us who have used essay type questions, as most of yours are in the law school,
right.
as I've been told, I don't know how many hundreds of points students have lost on my exams for that very reason.
Right.
And part of it is, as hard as you try to avoid becoming frustrated with him, you get to the point of saying, well, I just don't have time to fool with this. And
well, see, that's the other thing. Yes, you try very hard and not to get angry.
That's right.
Because as you're reading along and it takes so much time and you go back over it and over it and over it.
And what is he saying, or what is she saying?
Right, and you get furious.
That's right. And then there is a sort of a tendency to retribution at that point.
That's right.
Which all of us try to avoid, but it's very hard to do, particularly late at night.
Right, and especially when you're not sure whether the word is a word that would change the meaning of the sentence.
Exactly. Well, moving on as we're coming near the end, thinking about the various facets of the women's movement in the law school and on campus, and looking back over the period of time that you've been closely acquainted with it, what is your feeling about progress made and what needs to be done now?
Well, we've made progress, but it's very hard to detect the vestiges of male dominance in a lot of situations. And for instance, my time in the law school, in my early years, was an extremely hostile environment. And yet, everybody was totally polite and would be shocked at the idea that they had been hostile. And the same thing probably, to a certain extent, continues. Now, it's not a good thing it's like you get asked a question on a questionnaire, which is more important to you, a woman candidate or a candidate who's in favor of X, whatever.
Sure.
Well, to me, if I favor X, I don't care what the gender of the candidate is. So I think it's wrong both ways, and we still have that prejudice both ways. On the part of women who will fight to hire a woman.
Irrespective.
Right. Well, they're not always that,
Yeah.
they're good enough. And men who will not think that hiring two middle-aged white males is sending a statement to the community.
When you get to the point, let's say at the very senior kinds of positions, where you may have a distinguished faculty chair to fill, how do you think that should be approached?
Well, the problem, of course, is that we still have the leftovers of the past, so that many of the prominent people that you would consider are males.
Yes.
Just because
they came out of that system.
Right. So I'm afraid that you do have to try to look at women as well as men and then evaluate them and see the pluses and minuses, because sometimes, like the Air Force Academy has just learned, sometimes putting the right people in place is a good idea.
It is, and sometimes when you don't, you pay a heavy price for it, and they're paying that now, as they should.
That's right. And so if you have 2 or 3 chairs in a school, or let's say 5 chairs in a school, to have all 5 men sends a very bad message. So even if you have to hire someone of lesser stature but not ability, you should hire that person if it's a woman. Now, I feel that affirmative action is not necessarily degrading to the person who's a product of affirmative action, because so many people are products of affirmative action in a very strange way. I mean, like legacies,
Yes.
rich people's children, etc. Now, if you don't call that some kind of
Geographic
special
location or
yes. And I agree with the current litigation of Michigan that you need diversity in your classes. When I was on admissions committee, we would admit doctors happily because they add a different viewpoint to the classroom. Now, African Americans and Hispanics and Asians add another dimension to a classroom. And it's helpful, especially when you have some that will speak out.
In recruiting law students, thinking of just that point, how much effort is made what part of the screening process is the determination of people who are willing to contribute that way in a class? And granting that that's very hard to do.
Well, I don't think that, of course, you don't know who's going to speak out and who isn't. So what you really try for is diversity of background and hope.
Yeah. Yeah, and I sense that you've made a lot of progress, and that leads me to another question, because I remember, and I can't be precise in date, but it would have been about the time that you were involved. Dean Galvin and the law faculty went to considerable efforts to get out of the night law school pattern, and to have entirely day classes. And I understand now that we have reverted. I've never really completely understood how night law school integrated with the day, and what the reasons, other than for inconvenience to faculty who might not prefer not to teach at night, what the arguments were about night law school.
But you're asking the wrong person, because I came, I think, after the last class had phased out. So I don't know what led to that.
What the arguments were.
And I haven't been in on the new arguments. But one of the problems, which I suppose you can overcome, has to do with scheduling and has to do with facilities, which people don't think about. But it's the library that's very much impacted by a night school, because those students need to have access to the library later than other students, than day students.
Sure.
And also, I have to assume that all of the computer things need to be looked after at much later times.
Yes.
Than now.
The maintenance, you mean?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Plus, just, I think you should not treat, if you're going to have a night school, these people shouldn't be second-class citizens.
No, that's exactly right, and it's very hard to maintain equality.
That's right.
What is the trend, and maybe you don't know this, and this is just out of curiosity. What is the trend nationwide? Are good law schools going to evening colleges now again, or do you know?
I don't know.
Uh-huh.
I mean, I'm not going to discuss the motivation for this one.
Okay, I wouldn't ask you to. You were, of course, involved in rank and tenure decisions in the law school,
Mm-hmm.
continuing on faculty. Were you involved ever elsewhere in the university? You were, weren't you?
Well,
You were on appeals.
Only on appeals.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And one of the things that you and I have talked about on previous occasions, and you alluded to it earlier, was
Yeah.
the great unevenness, and granting that there are huge differences between disciplines
Right.
under the university tent. It's very hard to have an absolute consistency and uniformity. But one of the things that was a real problem 30 years ago was getting in the college particularly, getting those departments. It was really an old boy system until about 1970.
And that continued even later, because that was part of the problem when, with some of our committee work, we could tell that from the votes that were recorded and from just the way it worked.
Yeah.
And again, it was, as we discussed earlier, it was because things weren't written down.
That's right, and that's a problem, and that hopefully is being corrected. Let me move on. You were involved in the faculty senate,
Mm-hmm.
and you were vice president of the senate, weren't you? Or vice
Right,
chairman?
and then acting president for
Yeah.
a while.
What were some of the burning issues that the Senate had on its agenda in those days? Do you
I don't remember.
unfortunately, I served one term on the Senate and never wanted to serve again, and I always thought it was poetic justice that one of the duties of the provost is to attend all the meetings of the faculty senate.
That's right. That's
and,
right. See, and one of the things I told the law school was never run for an at-large seat, because you'll be elected and it's a waste of your time, which is a terrible thing to say. Having gone to a undergraduate school where the faculty ran the school.
Yes, Oberlin is very much a faculty, or at least was in your day, very much a faculty-run institution, and probably still is.
Now, I have to say one thing before we close that's, I think, is very important for everybody to know. And this was when I was retiring, my students came to me and said, you know, you'll have a portrait and they'll hang it somewhere. So first you must say that you want to have a say in where it's hung. And the first thing is, it mustn't be hung in a room that clashes with your outfit. And the second thing is, it mustn't be hung so low. This is the important thing for everyone. It mustn't be hung so low that students can park their gum on the bottom of the frame. And that was something I would never have thought of.
Nothing like direct advice on a matter like that.
Of something extremely important, and I want everybody to realize that portraits should be hung high.
Out of reach, so to speak. Well, one of the things about the law school that is I've always liked, it has been a little bit standing on its own ground, so to speak, in relation to the rest of the university, and it's had its own traditions. And your hooding ceremony, for example, has been one of, I used to enjoy it because I didn't have to do anything. I just sit there and enjoy it. And it was a lovely ceremony, and your tradition of portraits of deans and faculty, I think, is a lovely tradition, and so on. And I suppose this probably goes back to Dean Story and
Right.
then to Charlie, and so anyway, Ellen, it's been a pleasure talking with you, and I appreciate your taking time to record some of your observations and memories for the benefit of those who may follow us in the university. And I thank you very much.
I enjoyed being here, and I thank you.
Well, it was my pleasure. I was delighted that you were willing to do it.